All right. Well, hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Scott Wadle with the Planning Department, and joining me today is Allison Fletcher. Allison is on the project team. There she is. Hey, Allison. She and her team at Nelson Nygaard have been assisting with the project, collecting public input, compiling documents, and developing graphics. So we're very excited that she could join us today. And with that, I'd like to welcome everyone to the virtual presentation and discussion regarding the Downtown Streets Conceptual Plan. Thank you for joining us. This is an opportunity to learn about the planning process and to ask questions. A few quick notes before we get started. There will be a link pinned to the top of this feed where you can go and click on the survey and see the full streets plan, so be sure to check that out. In addition, to the online survey, you can view the draft recommendations in person in the Century 2 Concert Hall lobby. And that is available Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. Well, correction, 9 to 5. So with that, we'd like to go through a presentation with you. It'll go over the background information about the process, information also about the concepts. And as we're going through that, please submit your questions, and we'll try and take some of them as we go along. So thank you very much again for joining us, and we'll go ahead and we'll launch into the PowerPoint now. Okay, here we go. All right. So again, thank you again for joining us today. This is about the Wichita Downtown Streets Plan, and we're very excited to have you all here. Next slide. Sorry. So what we're going to cover is again, the purpose of today's conversation. We'll talk about the timeline of events. We'll do an overview of the process, and then we'll go through the concepts. So today, our purpose really is to gather public input. And again, thank you so much for joining us. We'd love to get your questions and your comments. Next slide. We are at a really important part of the process, stage in the process today. And through the entire month of October, we'll be collecting public input. And that'll be done in multiple ways, again, through the online survey, through social media. And there's a number of different ways that we're notifying folks about this. We have a poster that you'll see popping up around town. We also have a postcard that's been mailed out to a number of folks in and around the downtown area. So hopefully, I know that folks are receiving that even today, so hopefully we'll see some good response from that. We've talked about the online survey. There's a screenshot about that. And then we also have more information. So if you're curious about this or you're just learning about it and would like to know more, you can go to wichita.gov/downtownstreets, and you can see the project webpage, and there's all kinds of information and resources there, and an email where you can submit questions too. So again, we would love to get your thoughts and ideas on this. As we go through it, please submit any questions or ideas that you have. So a little bit about the timeline. Next slide. So this process has been going on for a little while now. It goes back to 2019. There was quite a bit of public input that was collected. And as we rolled around to 2020, we were getting ready to do an open house format where we bring everyone together, we set up boards, and we collect input, right? And we answer questions. Well, unfortunately, around the same time is when COVID hit, and so we, after gearing up and sending out postcards about the event, we had to cancel it with just a few days to go before it would have occurred. So it's taken some time, given us some opportunity to make some adjustments and tweaks, and we're coming to you over the months, last month and now this month in October, to collect input and feedback that will be used to shape the final report and final documents. And then after that is done, we anticipate that we'll update the draft this fall, and then it'll be the end of the year that we'll have a draft document that will be available and taken out to different advisory committees and groups, and ultimately then to the City Council early next year, it looks like. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the overview of the process. So next slide. So the downtown streets, what is it and where is it, right? Where does it cover? Well, the north boundary is Murdoch. The west boundary is roughly the river, Micklin area. The south boundary is Kellogg, and then the east boundary is Washington. And where we are in terms of the process, this is a pretty typical planning process where we start out, we look at where we're at today, we're looking at different data, we're looking at how the streets are configured, what kind of traffic they carry, that kind of stuff. And then we move into a phase where we're talking to folks, we're saying, here's the existing conditions, what do you want to see out of your community, out of downtown, out of Wichita in general? And we start to learn really what the community aspirations and goals are. And then that helps us to develop some concepts that folks can provide input on. And then there's an iterative process here where we develop the concepts, we go back, we check and see if we got it right, if we're on the right track. And then we come forward with the revised and updated, and then we check in with folks again. And then after we go through that cycle for a few times, then we get to the documentation phase, which is where we put the final draft together and take it through the formal review process. Next slide. So throughout Wichita's history and the history really of most cities, the streets have evolved. They evolve over time. They change to meet the demands of the day. And this is a really interesting process, a little bit unique what we're doing now with the Downtown Streets conceptual plan, in that it gives us an opportunity to look not just at one particular street or even a couple of streets, but rather to look at the network as a whole and how does it function. These photos, just talk a little bit about them on the slide, are from various points in time here in Wichita, and you can see just the varying things that were there. In some cases, streetcars, right, with angled parking, and now some of these are streets that are 5-lane streets with parallel parking, right, and there's buses instead, and in one case you can see a median that's no longer there today. In another photo you can see a one-way street that is currently it's a one-way, but now in the past it was a two-way street, right, and it had parking on both sides. So it's just interesting to see how these evolve, and this is an opportunity for us to talk about what types of streets, what configuration of streets would best help us meet the community goals and outcomes of today, and also the ones that are wanted for in the future. Next slide. So speaking about the community goals and really aspirations, so based on public input that's been received to date through the process, and we'll talk a little bit about how that's been collected, there are 7 goals that have emerged from that input. And here they are now. One is to enhance safety and health. Another one is to provide mobility choices of varying types. A third one is to prioritize active transportation options. A fourth one is to manage our resources in a good way that maximizes value. Another one is to embrace innovation and technology. Another one is to foster consistent economic development. And I think an overarching one, but a 7th goal here, is to promote vibrant downtown neighborhoods. So hopefully these are things that resonate with you. And we'll talk about how those goals also impact the concepts that have been developed. So in terms of outreach and how the public input has been collected so far, back in the beginning of 2019, we had a kickoff meeting. I think there was over 100 folks. What would you say, Allison? Like about 100 folks at that meeting at the Distillery 244?
Yep, we've had typically 50 to 100 people at most meetings.
Great. And then moving forward from there, we had a Douglas Avenue charrette and open house. This was a multi-day event where we brought in stakeholders. It was really focused quite a bit on East Douglas, but there were portions of that discussion that also helped inform the Downtown Streets process, and an open house for folks to come in and review designs. In June, we went out to the Riverfest, and always wear your sunscreen. It's an important lesson learned. We collected a lot of input from that, quite a few comment cards. We had posters hanging up with the different designs, and folks were able to stop by the food court as they were grabbing a bite to eat, fill out the survey, draw on some of the different graphics that we had. In September, we went out to the Open Streets event and also conducted a series of stakeholder meetings. And for the stakeholder meetings, those have been meetings that have typically been kind of like small focus groups where we would go out and meet with property owners or businesses that are located in downtown to get their reaction to some of the concepts. Next slide. So here's some of the photos that illustrate different ways that we've collected input. You can see the tents from Open Streets and from Riverfest. You can see some of the Douglas charrettes. There's also in June, there was a series of charrettes that were done downtown and at the same time as Riverfest was going on. And this was a multi-day event where folks could come in, we had a number of folks who took advantage of this opportunity, and they could work with the folks who were drawing out sketch designs, and they could provide comments and feedback about how those were evolving. And it was a really useful time to work one-on-one with stakeholders and with residents. So next slide. So we're going to go through a little bit of the designs. I just want to check in real quick and see how we're doing on questions. Are we doing okay?
We're doing good.
So far, okay. Again, send in your questions or your comments as you have them, and we'll try and address them as we're going through here. So one of the first things that we did, the project team did, is we looked at the existing streets and how they're configured, again, learning about what we have. So this graphic is one that you'll find online at www.wichita.gov/downtownstreets. And this one shows the different lane configurations. So how many lanes are there on a street? What direction is the street travel? Is there on-street parking? Are there bicycle facilities? And also, what's the width of the street? Well, I think not width. This one just does number of lanes. Yep. So next one. Then we also looked at the bicycle network and the transit network. So here's a graphic that shows in green the different bicycle facilities, and then in the orange and the red and the yellow, it shows different transit trips, the number of transit trips on a particular corridor. And you can see you get kind of this pinwheel shape down around the transit center because of the combination of the transit center and frankly just a lot of buses and routes converging there, but also because of the one-way streets that are surrounding it. Next slide. We also looked at the number of daily traffic, so the average daily traffic counts for the different streets and corridors. You can see those illustrated here in the colors. The yellow is the least amount of traffic, yellow and green, all the way up to the red, which is the most traffic. And that comes into play in just a moment. I'll show you how that works. Next slide. So roadway opportunities map. So what we did was the team looked at the capacity of the streets in terms of how many lanes do they have, how much traffic could it handle, and then compared to the amount of traffic that's actually using the streets, right? And that told us where there were opportunities for changes. And that does not mean that there automatically inherently would be changes recommended for the street, but rather just where there's the capacity. But it also showed us where there wasn't necessarily the capacity for change, or areas where you'd want to pay close attention to the details in a particular area. And that is, you can see a couple of those on here. I'd like to point out is especially one at Washington and Kellogg. You can see also up along Central, over at McLean. You can see actually north of McLean along Central. You can see there are some areas. So we can talk a little bit more in depth about those locations, but those are ones that we know that we'll have to pay attention to, especially. But then the ones in green, we know that there's a little bit more in terms of opportunities for adjustments. Next slide. So a couple of the things, a couple of the options, and there are trade-offs to any change along a street, right? There's not a right way or a wrong way necessarily to change a street, and you'll see some of these trade-offs talked about in the concepts when we get to those. But one of the things that we've seen here in Wichita and that a lot of other communities have done as well are road diets, and that's where you go typically from a 4-lane configuration to a 3-lane configuration. And we know that in certain cases, again, when you go from a 4 to a 3, there are huge safety benefits that come from that because as anyone driving along East Central has seen in the afternoons, the cars that are turning left out of those centermost lanes, they stop in the middle of a moving traffic lane. It creates a hazard so that vehicles have to stop for them. It also can create a possible T-bone situation because of blind spots that emerge. So we know that 4 lanes are more dangerous. 3 lanes get that turning traffic out of the way. We've done one on Waco just recently in downtown, strictly really because of the safety issues and the benefits that it offered. We've done a number of 3 lanes. Another one would be hydraulic, south of Kellogg, also Armour out by Town East. So there's a number of different opportunities, or a number of different road diets that have taken place in Wichita. Now, there are some situations where perhaps a 3-lane would not be work out very well, and that's situations where you don't have a lot of high volume of left turns, and you have a dramatic amount of traffic that you're trying to move. But those are pretty rare, and they need to be studied very closely in those instances. But that's an example of how a road diet works, and those are, you'll see some that are proposed in the plan, or at least in the concepts to date. Next slide, please. Another one issue that we look at very seriously here in downtown is that there's a high number of one-way streets, right? And so what are the benefits and disadvantages, the trade-offs really, between a one-way street and a two-way street? And so a one-way street is generally better for moving a high volume of traffic and moving it faster. And part of that is because drivers are able to switch lanes. Typically, these are done on roads where you've got more than one lane, so it provides an opportunity for faster moving vehicles to pass around others. It's also faster because inherently there's less friction in terms of things that are going on along the street that would cause the driver to be cautious. They don't have to worry about the two-way street. And it's a challenge in terms of bicycle connectivity. So if someone's riding a bicycle, they are required to travel the same direction as motor vehicle traffic. So for both bicycling and for driving, it can create kind of circuitous routes as you're trying to get to your destination. If you miss the driveway or something, you have to go all the way around the block and go around it. But again, the advantage there is that you can move a high volume of traffic and you can move it relatively quickly. The other thing too is that for pedestrians, they only have to look one direction to look for traffic. Now, a two-way street, the challenge or disadvantage is that in some cases is that it doesn't move as much traffic, but a big advantage is that the traffic moves slower, and by moving slower, it creates a safer environment. The other thing too is that it's better for bicycle connectivity and for motor vehicle driving because it gets you to your destination more directly. It's also more intuitive for folks who are from outside of downtown, and it increases business visibility because you are able to see the business from 2 different directions as opposed to just getting one chance for folks to see it. So those are some of the trade-offs. It's not a comprehensive list, but it's some of the things that we looked at as we were talking with community members about the concepts and about the existing streets. Next slide, please. So the techniques that we've talked about and the things that you'll see, the concepts, are not things that are necessarily unique just to Wichita. Streets and how they evolve are conversations that are constantly going on in cities all across America. And so here are a couple of examples from a few different places in the U.S. that have tried some of these techniques. So here's an example of Martin Luther King Boulevard in Chattanooga, Tennessee. You can see that in 2003, they converted from a one-way to a two-way, and it slowed traffic, which helped them achieve their community goals there. But there were still some safety challenges. And so they went back, it was an iterative process, and they went back and they said, okay, now what can we do? And they looked at, and they went from a 4-lane to a 3-lane. And I think, according to what we've read, that got them to where they wanted to be in terms of safety, accessibility, and it was able to handle the same amount of traffic as the 4-lane was before. Next slide, please. One that gets talked about a lot in transportation literature and planning literature is Greenville, South Carolina. This is because they really revisited how the roads were laid out quite some time ago, back in the 1970s. And there's been a number of years to see how that's evolved and what's happened. And they've really seen a big benefit to doing it. So you can see that they did pedestrian improvements. They also went from a 4-lane to 2 lanes. So pretty big changes there, and it looks like it's worked out well for them. Next slide. So part of what we're doing when we're talking about streets is we're really talking about the trade-offs, right? So for a few seconds of delay maybe in motor vehicle traffic, can you get big gains in livability? And those are some of the questions. It can also work out vice versa too, but we're always talking about trade-offs because there's a finite amount of space and there's only so many things that you can squeeze into it. So what is the best use of it? And that's where the community goals and the citizen input are so important, so critical to the process. Next slide. So again, these are the goals that we went over and that we've heard from the community, and we'll talk a little bit about what those mean to the concepts and how those have translated to some of the things that we'll see in terms of the graphics. Next slide. So now we're going through the concepts. This is a graphic similar to, there's one at the beginning that talked about the existing configuration of the streets. This one talks about, shows what they could be in the future according to the different concepts that have been developed. You'll notice that there's this large kind of dark blue area down to the lower left-hand corner. This is where the Riverfront Legacy Master Plan boundaries are. And so we kind of mapped that out and said, you know, that's a separate process that is taking place. So we're not going to delve into the streets too in depth there. The other note that you'll see over to the right is notes about the city's plans and initiative to do upgrades to the traffic signals. And that's going to have a big impact on traffic flow and just synchronizing everything. So we wanted to note the benefits that that's going to bring to the whole corridor. All right, next. Another thing that's going on is that we're not just talking about the streets themselves, but in downtown there's always exciting and new things that are coming along. There's a number of development projects that are taking place. And so this is a map or a graphic that combines the streets with the upcoming development that's either is going to happen, in some cases that have happened, and others that are currently underway. Because the last thing that we would want to do is roll out any changes for a street and do it right at the same time as a building is opening up and roll out the orange cones. So we want to be coordinated in what we're doing. And the other thing too is we want to make sure that the proposed configurations are configured in a way that they align with what's going on around it, the land use surrounding it. Next slide. So there's a number of recommendations for bicycle facilities. You can see them shown on this graphic here. You can see them where they were previously, Market and Topeka, 1st and 2nd Street. You can also see some additional ones. Waco is represented there, which is recently completed. But you can also see 3rd Street. You can see Waterman as well. And it shows Douglas, but I'll talk a little bit about how, based on feedback that we've received so far, some of the concepts for Douglas have changed over time. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. In addition to the bicycle facilities, you can also see transit routes really focusing and concentrating on Douglas and on Broadway. We don't know that this would be necessarily an immediate thing, but it reflects kind of this attempt to get to more of a grid system for transit and emphasize those main corridors. And the other thing that you see here is that it also does away with kind of that circling around at the transit center. Next slide. So one-way to two-way, we talked a little bit about some of the trade-offs there, the concepts that have been developed so far. And we'd love to get your feedback about these. Would show Market and Topeka going two-way, as well as Emporia and English, so and Main Street. So again, we'd love to get your feedback and comments on that, and we'll talk a little bit about those more in depth in just a moment. So Emporia, maybe you've read about this one, maybe you've heard about it, but there's an exciting development taking place at the corner of Douglas and Emporia. Actually, there's a number of them that are taking place. And as part of the one at the northwest corner, there was some funding available for infrastructure changes and improvements. And so that is helping to fund the conversion of Emporia from a one-way to a two-way. There's been a number of open houses and events that were held to collect input on this. These are the conceptual designs that were developed, and there have been construction designs developed. So this is something that I think we'll probably see in the fairly near future. So Market in Topeka. So you can see the existing traffic volumes there in terms of 2,500, 6,500, depending on where you are. The capacity with the existing number of lanes is 25 to 30,000 vehicles per day. So the concept here would be to take it to a two-way street. Currently, there is a bike lane on one side of the street, and this concept would put bikeways on both sides of the street, and that those bikeways would be protected with a vertical post or some kind of vertical element between the bikeway and the parked cars, and then there would be a two-way street with one lane in each direction. And this may look a little bit scary at first, but what this is a graphic that shows the space allocation, so from curb to curb. And what's so fascinating about this graphic is that the curbs, the width of the streets from curb face to curb face, vary pretty dramatically in downtown. So in some places wider, some places it's narrower. So this shows what's possible to fit in the curb space. And you'll notice that Market is on the left, Topeka is on the right, that there are some areas where in order to fit this all, parking would be removed from one side of the street. And I point that out because that's something that we want to get feedback and input on. But it shows where the bicycle facilities are, where the buffer, the size of the buffer, the parking, the size of the travel lanes, and so forth. So you can see it from on a particular street, from a certain block to another block, and so forth. So again, this is material that's online. It's also available at Century 2 for folks to go and check out in person, and we would love to get your comments and feedback on it. Next slide. So here is English Street. English is currently a one-way street. This concept would have it go from a one-way to a two-way. It would have parking on both sides, and you can see that there's quite a variation in the width of the street. And so for a couple of blocks, there'd be the possibility of putting in angled parking just because there's space is sufficient for that. Next slide. Douglas, again, this is one that we heard quite a bit of feedback about. This one, the concept today is to keep it the way that it is currently configured with 5 lanes. In the survey, we're collecting input on that configuration. So if you have any thoughts about what is working well, what could be enhanced, let us know. And again, this is just in response to the comments that we've heard. We're looking at where can we make strategic and quick pedestrian improvements. So we're looking into that also as part of this plan, but currently collecting input on the 5-lane configuration. Next slide. Again, the graphics that were posted online, again, we're taking comments about the 5-lane, and for right now, that's what the concept is, based on citizen feedback. The Broadway concept, currently it's configured as a 4-lane. We know that there's a fair amount of left-turning traffic on Broadway, and that so the concept is for a 3-lane configuration. There's some benefits, huge safety benefits for everyone on the street in that case. Also would allow for a little bit wider lanes for transit use, and just in general, again, big safety improvements. Next slide. Broadway, if you want to look a little bit more in depth and see what it looks like from block to block, there is an illustration of this one, so you can go and check it out. There is a Broadway corridor safety plan that was done for the area north of Central, and this ties into it and would carry bicycle facilities down to 3rd Street, and then from there they would go east, they would go west to connect into the ones over at Waco. But again, you can check it out, but for the rest of Broadway south of 3rd, just 3-lane configuration with parking on either side. So we've talked a little bit about the concepts, and we've talked a little bit about the process to get us here. I'm going to check and see if we've got any questions right now. Nope, looks like we're doing good. We have talked a little bit about the process. Let's go back one slide, Megan. So again, we've been collecting input through 2019. Where we are today is that we've been collecting input through September, and all through the month of October we'll be collecting input. So we really want to hear from folks about what they think. We'll use that input to do some updates in this fall, and we anticipate having a draft concept, draft plan really, ready for advisory board review and formal presentation to the City Council probably late this year, early next year. Next slide. So a couple of notes. First off is that this is a planning document, and so endorsement of this document by the City Council does not allocate any funding or resources for changes. So I just want to let everyone know that there's nothing immediate in terms of changes, except, we have talked about Emporia, and that's really been a separate process. But otherwise, as part of this plan, we're not looking at wholesale change. It's really an opportunity for us to have conversations about what our community's goals are and how best to move forward. The funding would have to be programmed that would require separate action by the City Council, and that any designs that are done, these are really preliminary, kind of high-level designs that are presented in this plan. They're fairly detailed in terms of they get down to the width of the streets and what can fit and what type of traffic and how much traffic. But any designs for corridors for construction would go through an even more detailed process. And so with other additional opportunities for public input and feedback. So just know that those are the disclaimers that I want to make sure everybody knows about. Next slide. So again, the request is please take time out, do the survey. It takes 5-10 minutes about. Please share your input and feedback about it. We also would like to see your comments or any thoughts you've got on social media. And then if you would like to, please know that there are stations available for you to check out in person at Century 2. So we'd really enjoy to see your comments, see what folks have to say. Next slide. And with that, that concludes the presentation. And I'll turn it over and see if we've got any questions. But before I do that, Allison, is there anything that I missed or anything we should go over, do you think?
I think one thing I was thinking about is just emphasizing when we're talking about the streets to kind of go back and interpolate with the network plans, thinking about the role of each of the streets and what we're trying to have them support in terms of that network for how people get around no matter how they're traveling. So when you look at each of the individual streets and think about those and share comments, we just like you to also make sure you look at the picture of the whole network that we're trying to develop in collaboration.
That's great. That's a really good point. How can you think of an example maybe that you could give to folks?
So for example, when we're talking about Market and Topeka, this is actually related to parking. One thing you'll also notice is that we actually are adding parking and supply on a number of streets. So on one block, there might be a slight loss of parking. On another block, there might be a lot. So from a greater level, we're trying to introduce more parking supply on street because that has benefits not only for people that need to drive and park closer to the destination, but it also has safety benefits on the streets as well. Mm-hmm. And then similarly, just thinking about some of those challenges with the way that bikes circulate north of Douglas, we don't have as many options south of Douglas. And so we're really trying to keep that in mind in terms of the circulation patterns.
No, those are great. That also makes me think about Broadway with the 3 lanes and a little bit of extra width for transit so that it's easier to get the buses through there. Yeah, it's an excellent point. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let's. Any other comments or any other things you'd like to bring up, Allison?
No, I think you did a great job, Scott. Thanks.
Well, how about questions? Megan, do we have any questions coming through?
So we have gotten some really good feedback so far, both on our social media pages And on our survey, we've had about 631 people take that survey so far. I have 8 pages of comments from people who took that survey. People really dug in, so we appreciate that. And we're getting some very specific feedback on our Facebook feed, which we appreciate. And I think you've addressed a lot of the misperceptions that we've seen from people maybe not familiar with this sort of development. But maybe we could just reiterate some of that. So for people not familiar, we're in the beginning planning stages.
Yes.
Could you just speak to that for just a second? You know?
Yeah. I think, and I understand this, is that when people maybe check out the website or they maybe just hear about it from a friend and they say, oh my gosh, is this going to happen tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the inherent kind of, oh my goodness. Well, I just want to reassure everybody, this is a plan and this is an opportunity for folks to get around the table, to think about some concepts, think about ideas. It's just an opportunity to have a conversation about how are our streets functioning today, how could they better serve our community goals, or maybe they should stay the same, right?
Yeah.
And then also, what do we need in the future? What do we want to be in the future as a community, and how are we going to get there, and how are the streets going to help us do that?
Yeah, well, I think what we're doing right now is really planning for those future projects. And what we're hearing a lot of is, how will this help the signal optimization? You did a really good job going over that. It's something I drive downtown every morning. So I think everyone's really thankful for this project that will help inform the next stage of our signal optimization.
Yeah, and the folks down in engineering are doing a lot of hard work on that, and there's a lot of technology involved, both existing technology, just the cabinets, and also you've got the poles, and they're a certain length, and the technology can only be updated so much. So they're trying to figure out, how do we get the best bang for the buck in terms of the components that are upgraded, and how do we do all that? So, and there's a lot of science behind the timing, and if you synchronize it for east-west, how do you what happens in north-south traffic? So there's a lot of factors that they're looking into.
Yes, and I think when people think downtown streets, and we're talking about a street diet narrowing lanes, and they think, well, that's going to increase my commute significantly. And that's, could you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. I totally get it. I mean, you think about a 5-lane road and you're like, wow, that can handle a lot of traffic. And then you think about a 4-lane road and you think, well, okay, that's probably just a little bit less than a 5-lane, but 4 is more than 3, so it's got to handle more traffic than a 3-lane. But here's the thing, is that on a 4-lane, when you end up with center turning traffic, so traffic in those 2 center lanes turning left, what happens is that it just takes that travel lane, all of a sudden it turns it into a turning lane. And so it stops all the traffic behind. It creates a dangerous situation because of the different movements that are taking place in terms of blind turns, and also people having to stop all of a sudden when they changing the radio or something. You look up and all of a sudden there's red tail lights. So we find that a 3-lane actually, in some cases, can carry more traffic than a 4-lane. And it has huge safety benefits, far above a 4-lane. So in a lot of cases, I mean, it can make sense to do a 3-lane, but we're not saying carte blanche that that's absolutely positively what it should be, but what we're saying is that there's trade-offs, and that it's a matter of just looking at the different scenarios and figuring out what's going to work best.
Yeah, and you spoke a little bit to the safety, but this will drastically improve the safety, not just for motorists, but for cyclists and pedestrians. I see more people bicycling to work every day.
That was one thing that we heard about from folks when we were at Riverfest, is we were there also on the weekends, but also during the week. And we had a lot of folks come up and talk to us, and they said, you know what, I'm just here to grab lunch. I work nearby, I work in downtown, and I got to tell you, safety, you don't know how many car crashes I've seen from my window.
Yes.
And I thought, safety would show up, but I didn't think that it would show up quite to the degree that it did. Mm-hmm. And so that's one thing that the concepts are responsive to, is the emphasis on safety, and it was interesting to hear it firsthand from people who work downtown.
Well, someone on our feed is talking about a specific intersection, and it's interesting. He talks about 2nd and Emporia. One of the buildings are too close, and it's a high accident area, and I know this because I was in an accident at that area. Someone ran the red light just right into me. So some of these plans will help cut down on some of those issues, but not just safety. There's also an economic development aspect to some of our planning here. One of the slides talked about increased visibility for businesses. Could you
Yeah.
speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So, I mean, it's relatively simple. If you have a one-way street, then businesses, if someone's driving, they only get one opportunity for you to see them, right? It's from one side, and once you're past, that's it. But on a two-way street, they can catch traffic going both directions. So there's a little bit more visibility there. The other thing, too, is that on a two-way street, well, actually any street with fewer lanes, where the traffic speeds are a little bit slower, still consistent, still moving, but a little bit slower, you get a better opportunity for businesses to advertise what's going on, because people have a little bit more time to see what's going on, because they're traveling just a little bit slower. Again, consistent, moving traffic, but a little bit steadier so they can see what's going on.
Yeah. Well, I've learned a lot about streets from you ever since I joined the city. And one of the first projects we worked on together, you told me, you said this, and it stuck with me.
Uh-oh.
Think about your favorite places to visit, your favorite destination spots, and think about what you like about exploring those cities and those towns.
Yeah.
And I've thought about that because you don't explore them from a car. You explore them usually walking around, biking, and
Yeah, I mean, it can depend, right? I mean, that's kind of the interesting thing is it's a balance, especially in our downtown, because you're talking about a place where a lot of people work, right? And they travel they commute to get here. So there's the flow of traffic and getting them in and out of their destination. But at the same time, we're also talking about an economically vibrant place where you can see other people and things are going on, right? And so how do we balance all of those factors? And I think that the concepts, the team has made a good attempt at trying to balance those, right? And so we talked about the advantages and trade-offs of a 3-lane versus 4-lane. We've also talked about one-way versus two-way. So how does that all come together as a network, and how do the streets function individually, but also as part of that larger network to help accomplish those different goals? And yeah, I mean, you think about places where you want to spend time, right? Where you want to spend time, and then you inherently you spend money, right? Because maybe you're loitering around, you're hanging around, you're going to the park, you're looking at the shops, or you're grabbing an ice cream cone. You're spending more time, and they're just vibrant because you're seeing more folks. So that, and still getting people to and from their destinations is, there's a lot. We expect a lot out of our streets, and I think that's what's so fun about this process, is it's an opportunity for us all to come together and share our thoughts about different ideas, different ways of configuring them and using them.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, we're getting lots of feedback. We probably just have time for just a couple more questions. One of the things we heard on the survey was the question, will this impact the neighborhoods surrounding downtown?
Oh, yeah. Great question. Okay, so the one-way streets go beyond downtown. They go out into Delano. They go, well, not even Delano actually, but out into all the way to College Hill, out east. They go south into the South Central neighborhood. They go north into Midtown. This plan, the boundaries are Murdoch to Kellogg. And we know that there are challenges when you have a one-way street and a two-way street come together. I mean, it just, there's logistics and design things that need to go into play. But we are really concentrating, just focusing on downtown as part of this initiative. So for folks who like it, the way that it is in their neighborhoods outside of downtown, I just want to reassure you that we're not talking about changes in those neighborhoods. For folks who maybe don't, that's a separate conversation, but really this one is just focusing on downtown. Yep.
Perfect. All right. One more time, could you talk to the next steps in this process?
Sure. So we're excited to get feedback today, tomorrow, all this month. We'd love to get it, and then we're going to use that feedback to help update the concepts and put together a draft document. And then that draft document will go out for, that'll be on the website, and it'll go out to advisory boards for review. It'll go, ultimately, then there'll be some tweaks and adjustments, and then it'll go to the city council as a final draft. And once it gets to the city council, we'll see if they've got any changes, and then hopefully we'll be asking for endorsement. And once it's endorsed, then it becomes an official document of the city and helps provide guidance for initiatives, projects, and infrastructure that come forward.
Perfect. All right. Well, that's all the time we have. Scott, thank you. I know you're so busy. Allison, thank you for joining us. And thanks for everyone who tuned in. Well, if you have questions, we'll continue to respond. But that's all we have time for today. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.